In this fourth talk, I want to talk about waterlogging and why it affects plants on salt land and how we measure it. Salinity is caused by the clearing of land for agriculture. We all know this. We've got vegetation, a forest that was over most of southern Australia before Europeans arrived here. And when rain fell in this original vegetation, there were very high rates of transpiration and very little or no leakage into the subsoil, and water tables were very deep. What we've done is we've cleared that vegetation to grow annual crops and pastures, and now when rainfall falls into this modified landscape, some of it goes through because we have lower rates of transpiration, we have some leakage into the subsoil, and over a period of time a rising groundwater. And when that groundwater gets to within 1 to 2 metres of the soil surface, we get the movement of salt to the soil surface through capillarity. The salt and water moves to the soil surface, the salt increases at the soil surface. But because we have shallow water tables, we've now got an opportunity for the development of considerable waterlogging, and so we often see in very severely affected landscapes scenes like this, where the soils are clearly waterlogged and in fact even slightly inundated. And this waterlogging has dramatic effects on the aeration of soils, because it makes soils oxygen deficient. And oxygen is required for energy production by all living systems. We're the same. Plant roots are the same. A plant root will take glucose, and with oxygen it'll produce 36 of these molecules of high energy called ATP, and without oxygen glucose is fermented to only produce 2 molecules of this energy compound ATP. And so you can see that as soils become waterlogged, we're decreasing that rate of energy production by 95%, and that has dramatic effects on plant growth, all metabolic functions, and in particular in saline environments, on the ability of plants to keep salt out of the roots. Okay, so keeping salt out of the roots is normally a process that requires a lot of energy. And so we find that when plants become waterlogged, that waterlogging increases the concentration of sodium in the shoots and chloride. But here's a data set for sodium. We've got wheat grown in sand culture, and it's been drained or waterlogged for 7 days. We've got on the y-axis there the sodium concentration in the shoot, and on the x-axis here different salinities as a percent of seawater, and here are the data. And you can see that if we've got 10% seawater or 20% seawater in the root environment, that combination of waterlogging with salinity is dramatically increasing the concentration of sodium in the shoots, and this is after a really quite short period of time. And there are longer term consequences of this for growth. I'm now going to show you a data set again with wheat, in which we've got plants grown under waterlogged conditions or under drained conditions. Waterlogged plants on the left, drained on the right, and we've got increasing salinity as we go down the photographs. And you can see that the combination of quite low levels of salinity, but with waterlogging, we've after 30 days we've effectively killed the plants. The shoots are yellow and they're not going to survive. Whereas with 20% seawater but under drained conditions, the shoots are green and they're going to grow to maturity. So salinity and waterlogging interact. What waterlogging is doing makes the plants leaky to salt, You have much more salt that goes up into the shoots, and there are long-term consequences of this for plant growth and survival. I can breathe underwater. I've actually been doing it since I was about 12, and I suspect that most of you listening have probably breathed underwater too. Of course, I do it using a snorkel, and I'm telling you this because plants can do something similar, and it's become very clear in some of the research that we've done that it's the adapted species that do particularly well in waterlogged environments, and they are using snorkel-like adaptations to be able to grow in this way. Let me give you an example. And it's the ability to do this that affects plant zonation. The story was sorted out by a PhD student, Summer Jenkins, and what she did was she looked at the zonation of tall wheatgrass and Puccinelia. These two holophytic grasses are often planted together, and so here's an example of a mixture of Puccinelia and tall wheatgrass. The Puccinelia, though, is all growing in the foreground, and the tall wheatgrass is growing in a slightly more elevated area in the background. Why does this occur? Why do we get this zonation? Here's the story. What Summer did was she looked at the proportion of Puccinelia and tall wheatgrass growing in a transect. So here's the transect, if you like. We're going from very, very close. We're in a valley on the left-hand side, and on a slight ridge on the right-hand side. There's a metre elevation between the lowest and the highest point, and we've got plant cover on the y-axis here. And here is her total data set. The pale green are the areas of Puccinelia. The dark green are the areas that grow tall wheatgrass, or the proportion at each location growing tall wheatgrass. And the white's other stuff. I'm not going to worry about that. Let's just look at the case for Puccinelia and tall wheatgrass alone. Right down here at the bottom of the slope, we've got 100% Puccinelia, more or less. And we're at the lowest part of the landscape, so the area is salty and waterlogged. Up here, we've got 100% tall wheatgrass. We're at an area about a metre above the lowest point. The area is got a lower level of salinity and certainly a lower level of waterlogging. So what's causing this zonation? Perhaps Puccinelia is more salt tolerant than tall wheatgrass. This is an idea that's actually been widely promoted in the literature, and I've probably been responsible for some of it. So Summer is now going to do you an experiment in the glass house, in which she's going to grow plants with different levels of salinity. So we've got salinity as a percent of seawater on the x-axis, and here's growth as a percent of the low salt controls on the y-axis, and there's 100%, all right? And you can see there's the growth response curve for Puccinelia, and here's the growth response curve for tall wheatgrass. So is Puccinelia more salt tolerant than tall wheatgrass? Doesn't look like it to me. Those lines look more or less the same. So we would say, no, certainly not true. There's another possibility. Maybe Puccinelia is more waterlogging tolerant than tall wheatgrass. We're going to do another experiment. This time we're going to grow the plants with waterlogging in this experiment. We've got salinity as percent of seawater on the x-axis, growth as a percent of the low salt drained plants on the y-axis. There's 100%. Here's the response for tall wheatgrass. You can see that the tall wheatgrass doesn't like waterlogging very much at all, and particularly doesn't like the combination of waterlogging with salinity. And here's the growth response for Puccinelia. You can see that the Puccinelia loves waterlogging, and in fact grows even better with combinations of waterlogging and salinity. So yes, Puccinelia is indeed more waterlogging tolerant than tallweed grass. The second statement is true. This is exceptionally unusual in the plant kingdom, and in fact, amongst the plants that we're familiar with, Puccinellia is the only plant that does this. So what's the story with a snorkel? Why is Puccinellia so waterlogging tolerant? Here it is in its winter form. If we take a cross-section of the root of Puccinellia that's been grown under waterlogged conditions, so the shoots are up there and the root tips down there, we find that it develops these holes on the inside of the root, in the cortex, which we call parenchyma, and these enable oxygen to be conducted from the surface of the soil down the inside of the root, so the root is acting as a snorkel towards the root tip, and that oxygen is sufficient to maintain all of the energy that the plant needs to perform its metabolic functions. So here's a cross-section of a Puccinellia root showing that parenchyma formation. But that's only part of the story, because these roots can leak in some situations. They can leak oxygen out, and Puccinellia has a second adaptation which makes it even better adapted to waterlogged environments. It produces a layer of a rubbery sort of substance around the outside of the root, which acts as a barrier to that radial loss of oxygen. And here's a cross-section of a Puccinellia root stained with a fluorescent dye, and you can see an extremely well-developed fluorescing outer couple of rows of cells which are preventing the oxygen being lost from the root surface. So Puccinellia has exceptionally good snorkels that conduct oxygen to the root tip. I need to finish this talk at this point by talking about the measurement of the depth of groundwater. The easiest way to measure waterlogging is to measure the depth of the groundwater, but I find that many people tend to dig piezometers too deep. I think the easiest way to measure the depth of groundwater is simply to dig a backhoe pit, and if you've got a shallow water table, the water will rise in that pit to the depth that it is in the rest of the soil. But of course these pits eventually collapse. It's not a long-term solution, but it's a really good way of getting a feel for what's happening in the environment fairly rapidly. So it's a short-term solution. In the longer term, we do need these shallow bores, these piezometers, but I wouldn't dig them too deep, because if they go too deep, you end up intercepting groundwater under pressure. I like bores that are probably only about 2 meters deep. You can then get yourself a tape measure and drop it down the hole, and if you've got a plopper on the end, you'll determine where the water table is in the hole. But keep them shallow. Okay, so waterlogging in summary. Dryland salinity occurs in Australia because of the presence of shallow water tables, and those shallow water tables can lead to waterlogging, especially in winter. Waterlogging causes an oxygen deficiency in the soils, and that decreases root energy production very dramatically. This increases the uptake of sodium and chloride into the shoots, and that decreases plant growth and survival. Adapted plants like Puccinellia form parenchyma that acts like a snorkel and a barrier to radial oxygen loss.